Time to start this first panel discussion in the last sequence of that first day, because we'll be all day together once again. So we'll talk about fleet renewal, air, maritime and river fleets with our experts. I have with me Antoine BOUVIER, your Executive Vice Chairman of Strategy and Public Affairs at AIRBUS. You probably know how to speak, don't you? Yes, probably. We also have BOZZONI EGRET, CEO of VEDETTES Paris. You've been involved in the Convention of Firms for the Climate. We have with us Michel BRAFMAN. We saw you this morning already. Thank you for being here, but here you are chairman of Section 4 of the French Air and Space Academy. I had to look that up. Section 4, you're a specialist of morals, sociology, and economics of air and space law. Everybody knows what Section 4 is, don't they? And now we have Jean-Paul DUBREUIL, the founder of CARAÍBES and French Bee. You employ 1,600 employees in the aviation sector, and you have 16 long haulers and 4 regional transport aircrafts. Our topic is fleet renewal, but first, what is at stake behind the renewal of fleets? Why is it currently a very major challenge? Antoine, you're beside me. I'll let you start. Thank you. Well, we have the whole aviation transport. In the whole transport industry, we have a very long-term roadmap. We have a net zero goal for 2050, and year after year, some decarbonization and emissions goals. But every trip starts with a first step, which is the renewal of fleets, contributing 20 to 25% reductions both in energy consumption and emissions. And I think this is very important in this debate to connect these two topics, energy use and emissions, that are directly linked in aviation, but not so directly linked in other means of transport that are electrifying, because the rare resource of decarbonized energy will be a constraint on all human activities, especially transport. So we need to have these two goals in mind, being fuel efficient with decarbonized energy and reducing emissions. So we have our long-term roadmap, but in the short term, we have considerable challenges in quantitative terms, but also in terms of exemplariness for the whole system. We see airlines are massively investing in fleet renewal, which proves that they are confident about the future of air transport. This shows that they have taken the initiative of reducing their emissions and their fuel consumption by investing, and this is a first major step, because this needs to be a successful first step to start the other steps that we can talk about later. Maybe to illustrate, Jean-Paul DUBREUIL, you have planes. Have you started renewing them? Is that what's at stake in the renewal? Well, for an airline, there are 3 very important things. First, the people making up the crews, then the planes, because the choice of aircraft is essential in the way you'll address your markets, and the choice of routes, so the type of product you want to offer. The issue with planes is that you need to be visionary and project yourselves far into the future. When I started long-haul flights 20 years ago, whereas before that we only worked on regional routes, we almost made a mistake, because back then everybody thought that to cross the Atlantic you needed a 4-engine aircraft, and so we wanted to go for the 340. Luckily, Airbus didn't really believe in a small French entrepreneurs who would cross the Atlantic. They said, well, don't take these aircraft, and so we found a lesser with twin-engine 330s, but we needed to apply the ETOP standard. We needed to have a landing point if in case an engine fails. So we started ordering 330s first in Asia as leases, and then we bought them. Back then, Noël Forgeard was CEO of Airbus. That was a big order, but now at the end of the year, we'll take delivery of our 18th new Airbus, a long-haul plane. That's quite significant for a small airline. Regarding fleet changes, I started very early on. We operated 330s. I was really happy with the plane, but then Airbus started talking about a lighter aircraft that would use less oil. And when you know that oil accounts for about a third of operating costs, that the economy prevailed back then. I put this order for the 330 over 10 years ago. So for the 350, so that was for high volume routes, and that was the 350 1000, and now we have a version with 480 seats. So yes, indeed, it's a major choice that I don't regret now, and that way I can continue ordering more. When you buy a new plane, how long is that for? How long do you hope to use the planes you're buying now? Well, technically, a plane is always in good condition because there are regular visits, overhauling them. The first planes we had in 2000, some are still flying. The sister ship is still flying for the Presidency of the Republic because the 330-200 that we leased at the beginning was delivered to President Sarkozy. It's still flying. It will fly for a long time. We still have one that's still flying 25 years on. So it's technical. Then it's about obsolescence that can be a problem with the technology that's no longer valid. That's what killed off piston planes and then four-engine aircrafts. That's why now you have a prevalence of twin-engine planes. But so the planes you're buying now, you'll still be flying them in 2050? Absolutely. Well, now we can't really see, there are no leaks from Airbus or Boeing to say there will be revolutionary long-haul planes. We know that there will be more mid-haul flights, mid-haul planes, but there won't be new change makers. Now the 350 is a big step up. There's a 20 to 25% difference from the previous generation, so it's also lighter. So very often I compare. When we service the Reunion Island, our competitors are Air France and Air Austral. They have 777-300, but we have 50 tons less at takeoff, 10 tons because of the weight of the plane, and 40 tons for less fuel that we're going to use. So this is all very concrete. We are talking about emissions problems. Well, that's a colossal saving. Michel, for you, what's at stake in terms of fleet renewal? Well, consuming less. I'll refer a lot to what the Air and Space Academy are doing and our 20th edition of our journal that was published in the spring. There are 4 well-identified simultaneous and complementary components. First, reducing fuel use per unit. One figure currently, the mix of types of aircraft currently being in service in the world consumes about 3.4 liters per 100 passengers per passenger per 100 kilometers, which is not bad when you compare that to cars. For instance, look at how much fuel your car is using if you're not driving an EV. So planes that are being designed that will be on the market in a few years, well, in our Toulouse conference, we showed that the realistic goal would be below 2 liters per 100 kilometers, maybe even 1.5 liters, depending on the architecture. What's the current figure? 3.4 on average. It's a slow transition. It's not going to happen overnight, but the journey will lead to a fleet renewal with current aircraft that are very fuel efficient compared to the immediate previous generation, which itself was about 30% more efficient than the previous one yet. So you can see that there's been a continuous trajectory that is extending. It's not going to stop now because of technical obstacles. So that's the technological front. The other fundamental aspect that we'll discuss again later, because that's really the crux, alternative fuels, what's called SAFs, Sustainable Aviation Fuels, that we'll need to talk about again, because this is a currently extremely rare resource. The third component that's worth mentioning, that's not anecdotal, is CO2 capture. CO2 capture to produce SAFs on the one hand, but also for storage. I know that there's a lot of debate about this option, but that's part of the equation for the solution, and not just for aviation. And the last component that you shouldn't neglect either is frugality. We are preparing to have to change the way we consume at some point, up to a certain extent, but frugality is not understood the same way whether you're French, European, or in an emerging country where living standards now help you get access to planes.
Vous avez des...
Marie, you operate boats for cruises on the Seine River. So is fleet renewal coming with the same challenges for you? Well, it's true that it's a challenge that is more overarching for us. Fleet renewal is about maintaining comfortable working conditions and living conditions for everyone around the globe. We have the GHG emissions reduction goals under the Paris Agreements, and this can not only be done through energy consumption reduction. So we need to bring down air traffic, and I love to travel, so I would love to keep on flying. But from what I hear, the technology is not ready to adapt yet. So if we want to observe the goals under the Paris Agreement, then we're going to need to use air traffic less. And then it also applies to other modes of transport. It applies to the automotive industry, and not everyone can switch to an EV. Otherwise, we wouldn't have enough electricity to use lighting in our homes. And so there are many things at play here. And the price of insurance is going to go up for everyone, and the cost of transport for everyone will be higher as well with the cost of energy. So it's a more general approach that we need to have. So we need to see how we can manage that kind of transport. And I'm not sure that there are many river carriers here in the room, but we need to see how we can adapt marine transport and air transport. And we need to bring down our energy consumption, and also, to a certain extent, the traffic as well. Although this is not necessarily a good thing for my activity, because in my business we just take tourists around on a river. So what about you? So from a very tangible point of view, can we reach the 2050 goals without bringing down traffic? Well, this is what is at stake. The challenge is to determine the quantities and objectives that we have. And as you explained very well, the starting point is the Paris Agreement. And the Paris Agreement established what we call a budget of CO2 emissions, and a budget of access to decarbonized energy for all of human activities. And then we need to allocate this budget between the various human activities. And the organization that is the most legitimate and the most independent to allocate this budget is the International Agency for Energy that under the auspices of the United Nations. The IEA publishes every year a very extensive report on the basis of three criteria. The first criterion is the social or societal use of an activity. The second criterion is the maturity of a technology and the time needed to develop new decarbonization technologies. And the third criterion is the number of tons of CO2 that have been avoided. And some sectors, such as aviation, are sectors where we invest a lot and where the results will take longer to be reaped. And on the basis of these three criteria, the International Agency for Energy will allocate this energy budget. And I think that there are a lot of constraints for the transport sector on the basis of these three criteria, because land vehicles will need to use electricity, but it shows that the aviation sector can continue to grow quite significantly while keeping track of the CO2 goals under the Paris Agreement. So this is my contribution to this debate, and this is obviously a fundamental issue that we are tackling at Airbus, because we want to make sure that we are observing the Paris Agreement. And the figure is currently about 3%, which is significant. So that's the 3% growth of air traffic, which is quite limited compared to the growth in previous years. And it does not take into account a certain frugality or the scarcity of airline pilots. So traffic, as projected by Airbus, would be around 3%. So we already have this constraint where we see the growth in air traffic reduced by half. So I encourage you to read this report, which is very long, about 500 or 600 pages. But it does set out a roadmap. And this roadmap is something that we implement in a very strict and precise way at Airbus with SBTi Scope 3. So we went on the platform, and it took us 3 years to negotiate with the SBTi and to use the right adjustments for us to be qualified as SBTi Scope 3. And so now we have a roadmap that would last until 2050, taking into account operational improvement, technological improvements, and SAFs. And if we are not aligned with this roadmap, which is documented year after year and published year after year, then the regulation factor will be air traffic. So quite naturally, if we want to comply with the Paris Agreement, we'll need to adjust air traffic. But in the meantime, air traffic can keep on growing. So, Michel, you read the report, and so what are the various difficulties that we are going to face? Well, we talked about SAFs earlier. So, just very quickly, I would like to mention hydrogen, because hydrogen is still born. Well, hydrogen is interesting, but as an input to produce SAF. So this is how hydrogen can be used, not to power propulsion systems, propelling systems directly. There's no way to overcome the scarcity of SAFs. To produce SAFs, we need to have decarbonized energy resources, and more precisely, decarbonized electricity. And this is really what is at stake here. We need to have electricity production facilities that are decarbonized. And this is not just for aviation. Absolutely, it applies to everyone. It applies to the whole society. So we're not going to look into this only for the aviation sector. Aviation represents 3% of CO2 emissions. So then we can extrapolate these results. So it's a problem at the level of a society. It's an overarching issue. So in France, we're talking about dozens of additional EPRs. So it's not just 6 or 12, it's a lot more than that. And in France and elsewhere in Europe, this applies too. And there are all the decarbonized sources from solar power and wind power, for instance. But they have limited uses. So we will need all of these options. And even though this is not the main part of it, we also need to mention the production of SAF from agricultural waste. It's difficult to have an exact quantity, but it would amount to about 1/5 of aviation needs, but only for aviation. So it would be very insufficient, especially from a more general point of view. So are you going to buy SAF-powered aircrafts? Well, we buy SAF because we have no other possibility. So we were at 1%. So we buy 1% of SAF from our suppliers. So we're starting to know more about the origin of SAFs. And we have another target to reach in the future, which would be difficult to reach. For two reasons. First of all, because of the availability of the product, because we talked about frying oil, but just to give you an example, even in our small company, we use 300,000 tons of kerosene per year. So there's a problem of scarcity of resources, and there's a problem of cost as well. Because you need because SAFs are worth 4 times more than crude oil. So if we need to switch to 70% of SAFs, I'll let you do the math. So we'll have to multiply the price of the airplane ticket by 2 or 3. So in the US, the government is currently paying for this price difference, for instance, but we will need to look for other solutions. So we are very cautious about this. With the beginning of the war in Ukraine, the situation was very difficult when the price of crude oil skyrocketed. And we had sold plane tickets with a certain price structure, but then we had to adapt because these tickets had been sold in advance. So we are very cautious about this. And for long haul, SAFs are a solution because 20, 30 years from now, there will be no electric or hydrogen-powered aircraft. I don't think that would be reasonable. Because we saw that for a 19-seat aircraft, you can have an electricity-powered aircraft for a flight of about 1 hour, but not for a long haul. So we will need to use SAF for these flights, but still, we are only getting this process started. So we need to improve the availability of this resource. And the price for operators needs to be improved as well. So in the short term, you're not going to completely renew your fleet. So what options do you have to improve your current fleet? So we have our airline, French B, which is a smart cost company with quite a dense configuration. And depending on the number of people, of passengers on the plane, the cost will be different. We are currently at 2.2 liters per 100 kilometers. And there can be some tensions also with aerial control. because some procedures are quite complicated and do not take into account the savings of oil. And we also need power generators, tractors, towing equipment on the ground as well. And for this, we need fuel as well. But we are really doing our best in order to use less fuel. Michel, do you think that these new options can work? Well, this will be a contribution factor of about 10%. So any contribution will be most welcome. But just to build on what Jean-Paul was explaining, we need to understand that the challenges depend on the type of use. Jean-Paul was talking about Aura and Aero. They presented their products of regional aircrafts. And in the middle of the spectrum, we have the A320 with the middle hull. And that applies to most of the aircraft that are currently used. And then we have the A350 with the two eyes and the American competitors. And this amounts to less than 30% of the flights, but it's over 75% of global consumption. So we can see that depending on the routes, on the types of uses, we can see that we have different challenges. So for Aura, Aero, it's mainly electricity and hybrid. And when it becomes available, it will have no competition because there will be no better way to fly with low CO2 emissions. And another option is to have enough staffs available from fracking oil or agricultural waste. So all of this is possible, but then we need to follow this complex roadmap. We need to reach milestones, and we need a strong coordination. Marie, are you convinced by these gentlemen? And what about the difficulties that you identify for our transport to be compliant with the 2050 goals? So only talking about my sector, we decided to be more ambitious than the Paris Agreement objectives. And we're lucky not to be involved in aviation. And so we do not have to take care of takeoff, but it's true that we need to make sure that our boats can float. So we are working on retrofitting of our boats. Can you tell us more about retrofitting? So we are removing the IC engine and replacing it with an electrical motor. And so the main part of our fleet will be electrified by a few years from now. So we'll have cut by 50% our CO2 emissions. But we know that each gram of CO2 matters. So we are really focusing on what we could do after that. So you were just talking about the social, societal value of long-haul flights. And we know what happened in France with the ban on short-haul flights in France for flights below 2.5 hours. So we know the impact this had. And the problem is that the train system, the railway system, is not ready to take over because it takes time to build an efficient railway. So our objective is really to communicate on the way we imagine traveling. And the idea is really to change our approach to tourism. So I'm not talking about business trips here, but really about tourism. And maybe it's no longer worth just taking a flight to celebrate a stag's do in Menorca for just one weekend. Maybe we need to approach tourism differently now. What about the economic balance of your operations? So how much have you invested for the retrofitting of your ships? And how are you going to explain to your customers that you need to do that? So the whole retrofitting of our fleet and the infrastructure, that amounts to about 1 year of revenue. So that's quite heavy to manage right after COVID. But in terms of amounts, for other reasons, we had to restrain our service because we didn't have enough staff. So we had to make choices in our commercial strategy. And last year, with 20% fewer passengers, I was reaching the same ABE. So the equation is not linear. And so you are making as much money, but with a lower revenue. Exactly. But now regarding the profitability of the retrofit operation, well, I do not know what energy prices will be like in the coming years. I was getting very concerned last winter when we were talking about maybe reducing access to electricity in Paris, and we didn't know if we could charge our boats. But we know that it will be profitable over 6 to 8 years. So I think that it is a profitable operation, and it will have a beautiful impact environmentally speaking. So we didn't take many questions today, but I think that we have time for a short Q&A. I can't really see you with the blinding lights, but I don't know if there are any questions in the room. In the first row, I can see that you are all looking at one another. There's one thing that we haven't mentioned is it's the furbishing of cabins. Well, of course, because it's very different whether we're talking about 300, 450 passengers. And on some markets, we're not talking about first class, but business class. And some passengers are really looking for a certain level of comfort. Other passengers, including tourists, are looking for the most affordable price. But people are no longer traveling standing up. No. But we also have a new generation of seats, and this way we can have a higher density in the cabin itself. And in our latest generation that will be available in December, we'll have a width that will have been reduced by 5 centimeters. And by working on the walls as well, we can improve passenger comfort. So I think that we can make some gains on this as well. Our seats are also less heavy because we know that the heavier the aircraft, the higher fuel consumption. And it's true that air traffic is increasing. So for leisure mainly. And this is where we can tap the greatest growth. So what about your seats, Antoine? Well, I think that we try to adapt to the needs of customers on the market. And we need to have a densification that remains comfortable. And this is really what the challenge is for the various classes of transport. And this will have an impact on the carbon intensity of the trip. Maybe 2 comments, if you'll allow me. 2.2 liters per 100 kilometers. For a long range or for to fly from Paris to Toulouse. For the same a trip by car, you need to have at least 3 passengers in the car for the car to have the same level, to have lower CO2 emissions. So people, so there are usually only 1 or 2 people in one car, except for when people go on holidays. So maybe that's something that we need to keep in mind. Well, that's true regarding the operations for the trip itself. But you did not take into account the cost of construction and maintenance of the infrastructure. You need to build highways, you need to buy motorways, railways, and all of this infrastructure on a given territory will use a lot of concrete, and concrete leads to a lot of CO2 emissions. And in terms of amortization, in terms of CO2 emissions, we're talking about 50 years to amortize the construction of a high-speed train railway, for instance. And so 50 years from now, well, that's 2074. So we need to have the right amortization for the infrastructure. And the infrastructure of air traffic is the air. It's airborne. And if we look at motorways or railways, so everything that is already there, it's already amortized. And for CO2 amortization, we're talking about 50 years for new railways. So for the approach of the UN, including from IEA, there are some criteria that need to be met by human activities. First of all, there's the carbon budget, and we are focusing on this, but we should not forget about other budgets. There's also the energy budget. Are we using more or less primary energy sources or secondary sources? And primary energy is what is important in terms of rare decarbonized energy. Then we also need to take into account materials. Just to take an example, a high-speed train will produce the same number of passengers per kilometers as an A320, but its weight when it is empty will be a lot greater. Yes, and you will need a lot of metal as well to build it. Absolutely. So we have the same number of passengers per kilometer per year, but a high-speed train, when it's empty, will have a weight that is 10 times as high as that of an A320. And so it's true that in aviation we'll have some challenges for CO2 budget and for energy budget, but it will be way better than any other type of transport in terms of material budget, because it is much lower than for any other mode of transport. Are there any questions? We have some microphones available in the room if you want to ask a question. Any question from the audience? Please wave your hand because I can't really see you. Right. So reaching the end of this round table. Well, so please wait for the microphone before you ask your question. So Pascal, could you take this microphone to the person who wants to ask a question? So I just have a very candid question. So I understand that we're talking about long-term investment. So we're not talking about years, but rather decades. And the routes that you are working on, the trajectories are more about a few years. So the decoupling between financial investments and objectives, well, it seems to be completely unfeasible. So I have a very candid question. How can we go about it? Because listening to you, I find it difficult to see how we're going to get about it. Because we talked about aviation, but the same is true for the marine industry. So how can we address this? We have objectives on a yearly basis for aviation. In the US, we have the retro-engineering of IRA. And it's implicit in tax credits, about 10% of SAFs by 2030. And the mix that is required by the European Commission is 6% by 2030, and it's already quite complicated. So it's very gradual. And for SAFs, the main question is the amount of investment until 2035, 2040, and beyond that date, the question will not only be about the amount invested, but also new technological solutions for eSAFs, which are new recompositions of chemical processes using carbon and hydrogen. So luckily, this is a gradual process, and we document each step to see how we can reach these objectives by 2050.
This is almost the end of this discussion. If there was only one takeaway, one key message, what would you like our audience to remember? These are debates that can be very political, very emotional. We need to make them objective and quantified. And then once you've made them objective and quantified, you need action plans. For these action plans to be public, to be discussed and be in line with our country's goals, i.e. the Paris Agreement. But we should avoid making quick judgments because these topics are so complicated that they need to be quantified and objective. Jean-Paul, a strong message. Well, as Antoine said, there are solutions that will probably appear. 10 years ago, we didn't talk about SAFs at all. It wasn't on the table at all. So we need to project ourselves into a long-term vision, but with short-term steps. And I'm sure that solutions will appear and they will solve part of the problem. You shouldn't be blissfully optimistic, but I know that artificial intelligence and others will help us bring down a number of barriers, and I'm still optimistic for businesses that will keep growing, because you would dream if you think that you'll put constraints on travel because people want to move around. Michel, my message is that it is possible. It is possible. It takes a lot of can-do attitude. We've already talked about many conditions. Now there is one that is essential for investors to be there. Financial or industrial investors. The petrochemical industry is not very present. If they need to invest, they need to have outlets for their products. And since the products are more expensive, then there needs to be regulatory action. That's one of our main goals at the Academy, for public authorities to play their regulatory role smartly so as to support that move and not constantly be a countering force for major economic challenges, especially for us in France with AIRBUS, which is an economic champion in its field. Marie, what could we take away from that discussion? Well, I think that the world is particularly unpredictable right now. I don't know if you've heard, but in 2014, the SNCF expected rail traffic to drop, and it's not really what happened. And so in our world that is so unpredictable, the best and the worst could happen. And so we quickly need to find a solution to this issue of transport decarbonization, because we need transport. Thank you so much to the four of you. We can give you a round of applause.